In my youth, I once had occasion to read through the catalogue of books and pamphlets that originally formed the personal library of Archbishop Richard Robinson, and I came away with the impression of a liberal intellectual who engaged with the humanism of the 18th century Enlightenment and questioned the moral basis for the continuation of the penal laws against Irish Catholics. We owe our extensive knowledge of the medieval Archbishops of Armagh to another enlightened primate, the 17th century Archbishop James Ussher, who preserved so many of the archiepiscopal registers and other records of his medieval predecessors, and published the texts of the 11th and 12th century Irish kings and bishops' letters to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the subject of church reform. Due in part to Armagh's association with St. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland, and also owing to the powerful patronage of the Nael High Kings of the North and Midlands of Ireland, the leaders of the Church of Armagh, whether they were bishops, abbots, or lay abbots, had risen gradually from the 7th century onwards to dominate the whole Irish Church, so that in 1005, the Munster High King Brian Boru acknowledged in writing in the Book of Armagh that the Church in the south of Ireland also owed baptismal dues and jurisdictional appeals to the supreme authority of Armagh. The history of the Archbishops of Armagh doesn't begin until the 12th century. Under the influence of the European-wide Gregorian Church reform, Cellach, or Celsus, the last in a long line of lay abbots of Armagh, was consecrated a bishop. And at the Synod of Rathbrassel in 1111, the Irish Church as a whole was divided into two archbishoprics of Armagh and Cashel, with Archbishop Cellach holding the primacy. In a later revision at the Synod of Kells in 1152, diocesan boundaries across Ireland were laid down which had a recognizable relationship to the boundaries we have today, and 4 archbishoprics were established in the sees of Dublin, Cashel, Tuam, and Armagh, with Armagh still holding primacy over all Ireland. In this transitional period, when authority in the church was passing from the early church leaders known as coabs, or heirs of the founding saints of the major churches, to the new diocesan bishops, not every bishop was accorded recognition as a coab of their local saint. For example, in Derry, it was the abbot of the Augustinian Abbey of the Black Cell in Derry that was recognized as coab of St. Columba. This was important because with this title came overlordship of the lesser churches and lands with which the early Christian Columban monastery had been endowed, which in the case of the abbot of Derry included large portions of the Inishowen Peninsula and the Lagan and East Donegal, administered by erenachs, or ecclesiastical stewards, responsible to the abbot of Derry, rather than the local bishop. This arrangement was doubtless due to the partnership of the Northern High King Murtagh MacLachlan with the abbot Flavertach O'Brolachine, as recorded in the mid-12th century Irish annals. By contrast, in Armagh, St. Malachy not only succeeded in establishing himself as a non-hereditary Archbishop of Armagh, but he purchased the Bachal Iesa, the Staff of Jesus, a relic reputed to be the original crozier of St. Patrick, from the lay abbots, and passed it on to his immediate successor, Archbishop Gelasius. Thenceforward, the Archbishops of Armagh are regularly termed coabs, or heirs of St. Patrick, including those who were English or Anglo-Irish. And the church lands which endowed the See of Armagh were reckoned even in Archbishop Robinson's time to be the most extensive of any see in the British Isles, and that was after a considerable amount had been hived off to endow Trinity College, Dublin. The fact that the Church of Armagh under St. Malachy played a leading role in driving forward the 12th century church reform, ensuring that the new archbishops received official recognition in 1152 in the shape of their pallia sent from Rome, and that St. Bernard of Clairvaux sponsored the arrival of the Cistercian order to Ireland, ultimately saved Armagh's position of primacy from the threat posed by the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1169, followed by the Second Synod of Cashel in 1171-2. This synod had decreed that the Irish Church follow the usages of England, including the claim of the English king to approve a bishop's appointment before releasing the temporalities of his see, the lands which provided him with an income. Once the English had set up the centre of government in Dublin, they began to favour that city's growing claim to be the natural seat of the primacy of the Irish Church, since it was fast becoming recognised as the secular capital of Ireland. And it was doubtless for this purpose that the Justiciar William FitzRalph transferred the Bachaliasa, the reputed crozier of Patrick, from Armagh to Dublin, sometime between 1173 and 1176, where it was kept in Christ Church Cathedral for the rest of the Middle Ages until it was destroyed by an overzealous Protestant reformers under Archbishop Browne. Even the purely Irish stage of church reform involved major changes, particularly for the Archbishops of Armagh. According to the Book of the Angel, a 7th century text preserved in the Book of Armagh, we are told that the Church of Patrick at Armagh claimed overlordship of all churches whose names began with Dovnach, like Dunamore, Dunapatrick, Dunshaughlin, with all other church foundations dating to the early missionary period, wherever they were located in Ireland. This claim now had to give way to the territorial jurisdiction of bishops over their individual dioceses. Although as late as the early 13th century, Primate Eugenius, or Echtan MacGillywither, was unsuccessfully seeking to have an exception made for the pilgrimage site of Croagh Patrick in Mayo. His other lawsuit enjoyed greater ultimate success. St. Malachy's struggle for control of Armagh against the dynasty of lay abbots had received military support from the king of Ariela, or Clogher diocese, Donogh O'Carroll. O'Carroll was a prominent supporter of church reform who pioneered the collection of parish tithes in his own kingdom. But he had also recently extended his political power over what is now County Louth, I hope you can see this, hitherto directly under the Church of Armagh, and Malachy permitted Louth to become part of Clogher diocese, and indeed the whole was renamed as the Diocese of Louth, and its first bishop was Malachy's own brother, Gilachrist Morgan. The Book of the Angel had clearly stated that Armagh's Terman lands extended south to the River Boyne, and all the immediately succeeding Archbishops of Armagh sued for the return of Louth. But it was not until a fiercely litigious Bishop of Clogher, Donatus of Fithivra, was promoted to himself become Archbishop of Armagh in 1227, that the boundaries dispute was finally settled in Armagh's favour. This solution, however, brought with it certain problems, because the County Louth area was one of the earliest outside Dublin to be colonised by the Anglo-Normans, who rapidly established a network of parishes manned by their own clergy. When the time came round to elect a new archbishop, the clergy of Louth normally voted for an English or Anglo-Norman candidate, and the clergy of Armagh for an Irishman. Numerically, the Armagh clergy were in the majority, but the Louth clergy had the support of the English king. However, the popes were familiar with the emphatic statement of Armagh's historic position of primacy found in St. Bernard's Life of Malachy of Armagh. From reverence and honour of St. Patrick as the apostle of that nation who had converted the whole country to the faith, that see where he presided in life and rests in death, has been held in so great veneration by all from the beginning that not merely bishops and priests and those who are clergy, but also all kings and princes are subject to the metropolitan in all obedience, and he himself alone presides over all. Successive popes in the 13th century tried to protect the independence of the See of Armagh, even going so far as to appoint saintly outsiders to the primacy. Saint Albrecht Suerbeer, who resigned in 1246 to become the Apostle of Prussia, and Brother Rainer or Rinaldo, an Italian Dominican friar. But these foreign archbishops spent almost no time in the diocese, defeated by the wartime conditions and the unfamiliar language. The day-to-day running of the see was left in the hands of the Irish clergy. In 1257, Abraham O'Connellan, the archpriest of Armagh, who had been administering the see for the absent brother Rainer, was allowed to succeed him as archbishop until his death in 1260. The late 13th century saw a very different atmosphere. In contrast to the tug of war for control of Armagh that had been taking place between, between the Armagh among the Irish and Armagh among the English, a new solidarity developed between the Irish and the Anglo-Irish clergy, who began to distance themselves from secular powers, whether this was the Dublin government or the Irish chiefs. And this reflected a European-wide movement in the late 13th century, which culminated in a violent struggle for power at the end of the century between the French king and Pope Benedict VIII. It has to do with the replacement of the administration of the French kings, for instance, by civilian lawyers rather than always relying on clergy. And this led to a view of conflicting aims of church and state. Happened in Armagh too. There was a Dominican priory in Drogheda, which recruited both Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Irish. Oh, we may have gone too far. Yes. Preaching friars. And one of these, Mel Padraig Oscandel, had been running an enthusiastic reform mission as Bishop of Atho before he was unanimously, by clergy north and south of Armagh, elected Archbishop of Armagh in 1261. He immediately set about restoring the physical and moral stature of Armagh as the seat of the primacy. In January 1262, Oscandel held his first provincial council at Drogheda, attended also by some bishops from the province of Tuam and the canons from Dublin Archdiocese, together with the justiciar, Richard de la Rochelle, and other lay magnates. And in their presence, he firmly reasserted his rights and privileges as primate. He went on to build a new cathedral in the Gothic mode, whose foundations underlie the present Protestant cathedral in Armagh. He walled the town, and in 1263 founded a Franciscan friary there. A similarity of architectural styles suggests that the new Bishop's Palace to the north at Bishop's Court Hill was built at the same time. And there is indeed a reference to the court of the Lord Archbishop of Armagh in an annal entry for 1266. And an Irish chief was assassinated outside the gates. On Oscandel's death in 1270, he was succeeded by an even more assertive primate, Archbishop Nicholas MacMailiasa, formerly a canon of Aeda Cathedral. As well as joining the papal campaign to free all churchmen and church lands from secular taxation, MacMailiasa asserted the right of the primate of Armagh to administer the temporalities of vacant dioceses in Ulster, as well as the spiritualities. That is, to control the lands and rents of the vacant diocese, as well as tithes and clerical matters, in contradiction to the claims of the English king. A report in the Irish Exchequer, written about 1284, complains bitterly about this. In Clogher, Derry, Raphoe and Kilmore, The Archbishop of Armagh appropriates to himself vacancies and demands of licence and appoints bishops therein, to the great loss of the king and against his liberties. Some say the escheator can never go to the bishoprics aforesaid on account of the Irish, and so these bishoprics are more easily passed over. It would be expedient to the king that no Irishman should ever be an archbishop or bishop, because they always preach against the king and always provide their churches with Irishmen, so that an election of bishops might be made of Irishmen to maintain their language. Nicholas Mac Meliasa had been accused of harbouring kinsmen who were Irish rebels against the crown, and it transpired later that he'd leased out valuable church lands in the County Louth area of the diocese to his own relatives, impoverishing the revenues of the See of Armagh for his immediate successors. But he was above all a champion of the rights of all churchmen against all lay authorities. In 1291, Mac Meliasa, with all the bishops of his province, Irish and Anglo-Irish, jointly took an oath to defend the ancient rights and liberties of their respective churches against any attack by a lay power, and to jointly pay the costs of a proctor to plead their case in the courts if necessary. Laymen who violated the church's rights were to be excommunicated. Bishops who failed to enforce their rights were to be fined 1,000 marks, 500 paid to the papal camera and 500 to be shared among their colleagues. This principle of penalising clergy who agreed to lay taxation anticipated the famous bull Clericis Laicus issued by Pope Boniface VIII, I think I said Benedict earlier, Boniface VIII in 1296. And in 1297, Archbishop Nicholas Mac Meliasa toured the courts of O'Neill, MacMahon and Maguire in Ulster, proclaiming the text of the papal bull and extracting their agreement to a series of articles renouncing the imposition of coin and livery or any other exactions from churchmen and church lands in their area. Interestingly, some of these articles extended the church's protection over clerics, pilgrims, nuns, widows, and other destitute persons, even where these were not living on church lands, so that unless such defenceless persons were guilty of theft, those who attacked them in time of peace were answerable to the church courts, a clause suggesting a return to Abbot Adovnon's law of the innocents that had been enacted in 697 AD. This vigorous defence of the church's independence served only to confirm the English king's conviction that no Irishman should ever be an archbishop or bishop. For the whole remainder of the Middle Ages, no further Gaelic Irishman was allowed to hold the See of Armagh except for David McGarrity in the mid-14th century, who had not only served for years as an administrator for the absentee English Archbishop Stephen Seagrave, but was sufficiently anglicised to join with the campaign promulgated in the Statute of Kilkenny to ban all Irish poets and fine anybody who supported them financially. This change of personnel was very damaging to the See of Armagh itself. English and Anglo-Irish archbishops from then on lived permanently in County Louth, with a townhouse in Drogheda and 2 archiepiscopal manors on the early Christian church sites of Dromiskin and Termonfeckin in County Louth. The Archdeacon of Armagh was also based in Louth, and the area north of the Fuse Mountains was administered by the Gaelic Irish Dean and Chapter of Armagh. Theoretically, the Archbishop was supposed to conduct regular visitations of every parish in his diocese, but these became rarer and rarer north of the Fuse Mountains, often interrupted by warfare conditions. In the absence of the primate, the Dean of Armagh acted as his proxy. This development had financial implications, because we're told that the dues in cattle and foodstuffs rendered as hospitality to the visiting archbishop and his train by the local Earnanox from the extensive church lands in each parish was much more valuable than the rents and tithes, which constituted the regular income sent to the archbishop's headquarters in Louth. And these hospitality dues could not be collected when the archbishop was not personally present. The town of Armagh dwindled in importance after the makeover it had received in the late 13th century, and the manor at Bishop's Court Hill remained empty for long periods. The immediate successor of David MacCarrochty was a local man, Richard FitzRalph of Dundalk, who won fame throughout Europe for his intellectual theories on grace and property rights, which may have had some influence on Wycliffe and the Peasants' Revolt, since we hear that some of the rebels questioned the rights of sheriffs to hold office and exercise authority if they were not in a state of grace. But the primate was equally famous for a bitter feud against the Franciscan friars, who he accused of short-circuiting the pastoral authority of local clergy by absolving sinners in return for money without imposing due penances. He was seemingly a fluent Irish speaker, employed by the government to negotiate with the Irish chiefs, and interestingly, his sermon diary has been preserved, noting the date, place, and subject matter of each sermon, by which we have a record of his reaction to the Black Death in Ireland, and know that he harangued the merchants and craft guilds of Drogheda, exhorting them to allow native Irishmen into their guilds as apprentices, with the possibility of promotion to master craftsmen. He eventually put the whole town of Drogheda under interdict in a dispute over tithes. And in 1352, he summoned all the bishops of Armagh province to a synod in which he scolded them as hirelings and plunderers, concerned only with merchandise like shopkeepers, fornicators and adulterers, gluttons and drunkards, from which we can deduce that he was both an idealist and irredeemably confrontational. During his time, a Hungarian pilgrim, George Grisafan, came on pilgrimage to St. Patrick's Purgatory in Lough Derg, and there experienced visions, including a divine message to Richard FitzRalph to lift the interdict he'd imposed on Drogheda. The primate was so impressed, he sent Grisafan to Avignon and arranged for the publication of his visions, stimulating more and more pilgrims from other European countries to visit Lough Derg in the 14th and 15th centuries. His successor was another local man, Milo Sweetman, and with his appointment in 1361 begins the series of archiepiscopal registers, which are such a valuable source for the history of Armagh Diocese from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Unlike FitzRalph, who spent much of his time at the papal court in Avignon, Sweetman did conduct visitations of the various dioceses in his province in person, partly perhaps to enhance his income, since the Avignon papacy had now begun to charge a fee for papal bulls of appointment. And this was to be a constant source of debt for the Archbishops of Armagh up to the Reformation, as their lands and rights on paper were far in excess of the actual income they could extract from the clergy and laity in their diocese. Milo met with bitter opposition, particularly from a group of canons in the rural deanery of Tullahogue, who charged him at the papal court with homicide, heresy, adultery, and incest, though he was to be subsequently absolved. In despair, he appealed to Neil Moore, the great O'Neill of Tyrone, to collect his rents and tithes for him, which O'Neill agreed to do, though he then hesitated to hand them over until certified of the Archbishop's absolution. His appeal to O'Neill to act as the lay arm of the church, to enforce the Archbishop's authority, was a return to the policies of Nicholas MacMeliasa and the constitutions of Armagh in 1297. It initiated a pattern of intermittent alliance between church and state, which continued throughout the 15th and into the early 16th century, ending with letters patent from Conbachach O'Neill renouncing his claim to the lands of Glenall. And it reflected a European-wide trend in this period for the nation-states of Europe, France in particular, to regulate their relations with the Pope through a series of concordats. We have no surviving register for the next Archbishop, John Colton, an Englishman who had served as Chancellor of Ireland before his appointment to Armagh. But we have the decrees passed by a provincial synod he held, and we have a unique notarial record of his visitation of the Diocese of Derry in 1397, a translation of which by the Reverend Scott Porter was published in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology for 1853. Apart from the deplorable state of affairs he found in the Columban Black Cell in Derry, where an aristocratic O'Doherty abbot had seized control of the treasury and alienated some of the monastery's lands to give a bride price for his concubine, the individual parishes in Derry diocese seemed in good shape, with churches in good repair, hospitable Erenachs and pious lay people. The ability of both Sweetman and Coulton to conduct visitations in person in the Gaelic Irish parts of the province may partly be the result of the much greater involvement of the English government in Irish affairs at this time, culminating in two major expeditions by King Richard II, 1394-5, and again in 1399. However, it was a very different story in the 15th century. The deposition of Richard II and the seizure of power by the Lancastrian Henry IV led to minor uprisings all over the British Isles, most notably in Wales under Owen Glendower. And this was followed by a renewal of the 100 Years' War with France, and subsequently the civil wars of the Roses in England. The Anglo-Irish government in Dublin was thrown back on its own resources. In Armagh, Primate Nicholas Fleming, who was a local man from Anglo-Irish Meath, appears to have hired a band of Irish kerns to accompany his bailiff, trying to collect rents from church tenants north of the Fuse. And even these strong-arm tactics failed to prevent his church lands there being overrun by the armed followers of the O'Neills, junior kinsmen of the great O'Neill of Tyrone. These princes first tried to alienate church lands completely, but under threat of excommunication and a potential crusade against them for heretical pravity, they eventually settled down to reside on the lands, paying a minimal rent, pro modicum, as the Archbishop says, to the Archbishop, and founding a branch of their dynasty known as the O'Neills of the Fuse. The rise of the O'Neills of the Fuse has been chronicled by Cardinal O'Fee in a series of articles in Seanachas Ardbacha. The record of Nicholas Fleming's correspondence and eventual settlement of the O'Neills is contained in his register and includes a promise of safe conduct to enable the Archbishop to travel north of the Fuse Mountains to carry out visitations and other necessary administration. After these initial years of chaos, the administration of Ireland in the 15th century became dominated by the great earls of Ormond and Kildare. James, the fourth Earl of Ormond, known as the White Earl, had much success in controlling the activities of the Irish chiefs by a mixture of armed force and diplomacy up to his death in 1452. But in his early years, his power was often interrupted by the rival family of the Talbots, led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, an English governor who believed in ruling by armed force alone. The next Archbishop of Armagh, John Swain, was a very highly qualified academic and diplomat who had gained his reputation in negotiations of the Great Council of Constance, 1415-18, which brought an end to the papal schism between rival popes at Avignon and Rome. Primate Swain wrote despairingly to the English king that either the White Earl of Ormond or John Talbot could control Ireland and keep the peace quite satisfactorily, but the constant feud that they and their followers kept up against each other nullified their influence. As a result, Archbishop Swain hardly ever visited Armagh among the Irish in person. This Talbot-Ormond feud was eventually resolved in the 1440s by a marriage alliance between the families, and Ormond dominated the Dublin administration to his death in 1452. The registers of the next three archbishops, John Preen, John May, and John Bull, are preserved in a confused condition because, as all their documents were issued under the name Johannes Audmarcanus, John, Archbishop of Armagh, their chronological order has been lost and are bound into just two registered, labelled Preen and May, with the deeds of John Bull intermixed among each. However, a fresh calendar of Bull's records has been published by Anthony Lynch in Seanchas Ardmhacha, volume 14, 1991. In the records of all three primates, we can see that when Ormond, or later Thomas Fitzgerald, the 7th Earl of Kildare, brought Owen the Great O'Neill of Tyrone and later his son Henry O'Neill to submit to the English crown, there was always a clause included by which the O'Neill promised a safe conduct to the Archbishop of Armagh to come and go freely to Armagh city and conduct visitations in the northern part of his diocese unmolested. In 1441, we are told Owen performed this submission on his knees in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, taking his oath on the Bachaliasa, or the Staff of Jesus, the reputed crozier of St. Patrick that had been taken away from Armagh by the Norman justiciar FitzRalph in the 12th century. Apparently, by the time John Preen died in 1443, Owen O'Neill had fallen out with Ormond again, because he then induced the Irish Cathedral chapter at Armagh to elect Archbishop Richard Talbot of Dublin, the brother of Ormond's rival John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, to be the new primate of Armagh, and wrote a letter to Henry VI, recommending Talbot as somebody who would be very active in recovering the rights and property of the church. Since much of the property of the church had been alienated by O'Neill's own kinsmen, it's hard to see why he would promote the appointment of this formidable churchman, if not to annoy Ormond. Nothing came of this proposed election, and it was surely out of the question that Talbot would have exchanged the metropolitan see of Dublin for the poverty-stricken and decaying city of Armagh. It has been noted that the next two archbishops, John May and John Bull, or John Bull, bear the surnames of two major English merchant families of the 15th century, and the records of the archiepiscopal registers tend to confirm this connection with commerce. They contain the texts of a series of concordats drawn up between the O'Neills and the archbishops, in which the chiefs promised to protect the archbishop's messengers, safeguard him on visitations, and jointly enforce the payment of his rents, in return for an annual pension paid in cash or as a consignment of English cloth, with some extra yards of particularly fine cloth for the great O'Neill's own suit. In addition, there seems to be a hint that John May, when he was first appointed, had plans to redevelop the city of Armagh itself, selling or leasing house sites to outside investors who might build it up and establish some businesses there. The only evidence for this is the negative reaction of the citizens of Armagh themselves, who cherished their immemorial hereditary status as nativi, or born serfs of the archbishop. And in 1444, they came in a body to demand the primate's agreement to 3 articles. The first article is that no cleric or layman shall be given a charter to the lands of any nativus as long as there can be found any one of his cousins or relatives who is humble and obedient and capable of bearing the ordinary and extraordinary burdens attached to the tenure of the land. Also, the second article is this: if any nativus dies without an heir or heirs among his cousins or relatives, the nearest and most serviceable Armagh man shall be appointed to succeed to his lands ahead of all competitors, as long as this Armagh man comes into the presence of his lordship with letters of commendation from all the citizens. And the third article is this: that his lordship of Armagh will defend all his citizens among the English and the Irish in all ways and means that he can, and will guarantee them as much as he can unless they deserve punishment. These articles were presented by the citizens once more to Primate John Bull in 1458 and duly confirmed by him. A further sign that John Bull or John Bull, like Primate May, had commercial connections came when in 1463 Bull persuaded Henry the Great O'Neill of Tyrone to delegate authority to him to grant safe conducts to merchants coming and going to the ports of Ulster for the purpose of trade. We have the text of one such official safe conduct issued by the Archbishop in that year to 8 Drogheda merchants, including William Simcock, who was for a long time Lord Mayor of Drogheda. Henry O'Neill, chieftain of his nation, claiming himself Prince of the Irish of Ulster, has offered his safe and secure conduct to all approaching or returning through the seaports of the aforesaid earldom for all future times, in times of war or of peace, with their persons, men, ships, goods, and all manner of possessions, as long as it should be certified to him through our testimonial letters concerning the names of those coming, under the strictest legal penalties to be fulminated against him, his subjects and his country, if they should contravene in anything. Although Archbishop Bull describes the great O'Neill here as merely claiming himself Prince of the Irish of Ulster, in a number of his letters addressed directly to O'Neill himself, he styles him formally Prince of the Irish of Ulster without reservation, and in one letter he begins, Your Excellency. It may be significant that Bull, at the time of his appointment to Armagh, had been Bishop-elect of Kildare. This suggests that he could have owed his promotion to Armagh to the influence of Thomas Fitzgerald, the 7th Earl of Kildare, who ruled Ireland as Deputy Lieutenant to the Duke of York in 1457, the year of Bull's appointment. The Kildare Geraldines were politically allied to the O'Neills of Tyrone, to the point where in 1480, Henry O'Neill's son, Con Mór, was married to the sister of Gerald Mór, 8th Earl of Kildare, and was granted full citizenship under English law. However, cooperation between the primates and the great O'Neill of Tyrone seems to cease with the death of John Bull. The drastic diminution in the revenues of the primates, the revenues that the primates could obtain from the church lands of Armagh, and the rising scale of papal taxation, ended by landing the archiepiscopal see hopelessly in debt. The Pope's demand that the next primate-elect should clear his predecessors' debts and pay for his own bulls of appointment before he could be confirmed in office, led to almost 10 years of vacancy in the see, until the office was given to the papal receiver, Octavian de Palatio from Florence. Octavian, as a papal banker, was uniquely qualified to sort out the financial problems of the see, which he did by renegotiating terms with his creditors, reducing the debt to manageable proportions. Unlike earlier foreign appointees, Octavian resided in his diocese throughout his long 35-year term in office. And although he was instrumental in seeing the diocese of Down filled by another Italian bishop, his appointee was a popular and saintly man who also lived for a long time and resided at Downpatrick. The extensive register Octavian has left behind, 3 volumes of it, is testimony to his conscientious performance of his duty wherever he could gain access to the churches in his jurisdiction. However, he resided permanently in County Louth. On one occasion, when he was attempting a visitation of Armagh, his luggage train was attacked and robbed by the Dean of Armagh at the head of an armed band. The reason for this was that Octavian did not consider the Dean, Dionysius of Killane, to be a suitable person to hold that office, and was trying to replace him with a more pious candidate. And in view of the Dean's behaviour, one would have to sympathise with Octavian's viewpoint. Similarly, when in 1487 the great Earl of Kildare and his associates rebelled against Henry VII and crowned the impostor Lambert Simnel in Christchurch Cathedral, Archbishop Octavian, who was on the King's Council in Ireland, spoke forcefully against it and immediately informed the King. Relations with the great Earl remained hostile, and in revenge, The Earl's brutal ally, James Keating, prior of the Knights Hospitallers of Kilmainham, led his band of Keating Cairn on a destructive rampage through the Archbishop's manors in Louth. Even had Octavian's relations with the great Earl been better, the alliance between the O'Neills and the Fitzgeralds, which had offered some security and stability to Archbishop Bull, no longer held in Octavian's time. The Earl's brother-in-law, Conmore O'Neill, was assassinated in 1493 by his younger brother, Henry Og O'Neill, who was allied to the Butlers of Ormond rather than the Fitzgeralds of Kildare. Henry Og was assassinated in his turn by Conmore's sons, and a succession struggle ensued, making the visitation of Armagh among the Irish even more perilous. So Armagh city reached its lowest point of neglect through no fault of Octavian, who is rumoured to be identical with the Italian friar whose satirical Latin verse on Armagh is quoted in Fynes Morrison's itinerary in 1600. Civitas Armacana, civitas vana, absque bonis moribus, mulieres nudae, carnes crudae, palpitas in idibus, city of Armagh, city in name only, lacking good manners, naked women, raw meat, poverty-stricken buildings. The 16th century did little to improve matters, but I will leave that story for others to tell.